Sacrifice Outlet is a community term for cards that let you sacrifice your creatures for various effects. These can be far stronger than they look, often working with various cards that have powerful death triggers or reanimation spells. For this list, we're being a bit narrow with the definition of a sacrifice outlet, only including cards that let you sacrifice creatures and let you do so multiple times a turn. Starting us off at number 10, we have Butcher of the Horde. This is a 5/4 demon with a mana cost of 1, 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach. It is the ability where you can sacrifice another creature to give Butcher one of 3 abilities until the end of turn. You can give it Vigilance, meaning it doesn't have to tap to attack, Lifelink, meaning any damage it deals causes you to gain that much life, and Haste, allowed to attack the turn it enters the battlefield. Butcher is a very interesting sacrifice outlet, as while it does let you sacrifice creatures for no mana, it doesn't really want you to sacrifice a ton of creatures all at once. Rather, the card gives you multiple different options on any given board state as to what exactly it can do. The card already has fairly powerful stats when combined with its evasion, so giving it any of these 3 abilities just made it a lot more useful. The card didn't really see play in decks that wanted to sacrifice creatures. Rather, it was used in mid-range decks that produce a lot of tokens anyway, and could afford to toss one to the Butcher every now and then to make an amazing card. These decks played a lot of cards like Hordeling Outburst and Goblin Rabblemaster, which produce a ton of tokens that were normally used for dealing damage, but could be turned into fodder very easily. Butcher is a card that can go from offense to defense very quickly. A 5/4 flyer with haste is capable of ending the game seemingly out of nowhere, but Vigilance and Lifelink are both very defensive abilities. This allows the Butcher to put some pressure on your opponent without leaving themselves open to surprise attacks and keeping their life total high, making Butcher a great card against basically every deck. Aggro, mid-range, or control, the card always had a use. The only time Butcher was bad was basically when you had no other creatures on the board. While Butcher is a strong card, it's not all that great at eating all your creatures, which is why the card hasn't seen that much play when there are other options available. And at number 9, we have Nantuko Husk. This is a 2/2 zombie insect with the mana cost of 2 and 1 black. It is an ability where you can sacrifice a creature to give Husk +2/+2 until end of turn. This is a card that there are tons of different versions of that have been printed over the years, such as Blood Baron, Phyrexian Ghoul, and Vampire Aristocrat. All of these cards have the same stat line and basically identical abilities. However, Husk just so happens to be in the best environment for a card like this. There was a very powerful deck in Tekir Standard built around the card Rally the Ancestors. This is an instant with the mana cost of X and 2 white that has the effect where you return each creature card the mana value of X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. You exile all those cards at the beginning of your next upkeep, then you exile Rally the Ancestors. The deck's general strategy was to fill their graveyard with powerful, cheap creatures with enter the battlefield abilities. Then they'd find a copy of the Husk and the card Zulaport Cutthroat. The Cutthroat was a 2 mana 1/1 that gave you 1 life and made your opponent lose 1 life whenever a creature you controlled died. So you would bring all of your creatures back with the Rally, get the value off of the cards, and then sacrifice them to Husk before you got to exile during your upkeep, dealing damage with Cutthroat each time. This would let you keep all the creatures around for the next Rally. All of those bodies also made the Husk a huge creature, basically forcing your opponent to have a blocker or removal spell to not die on the spot. This deck proved to be extremely powerful, mostly because there really wasn't any angle to attack it from. There weren't all that many good pieces of graveyard hated the format, and most of the ones that did exist were very easy for the deck to deal with. Cards like Unoffensive the Foremost could stop any of your opponent's death triggers from working by exiling the cards, which would stop all the damage from Cutthroat from going through. However, cards like Reflector Mage could answer these threats to your strategy from doing anything. Outside of these onboard threats, your options were limited. This all led to 4-color Rally decks being a huge force in the standard. Husk was in the right place at the right time, which really shows just how strong the ability to sacrifice your creatures for free can be. And at number 8, we have Phyrexian Altar and Ashnod's Altar, due to how similar they are. Phyrexian Altar is an artifact with a mana cost of 3. It is the ability where you can sacrifice an artifact to add 1 mana of any color. Ashnod's Altar has the same mana cost, but has the ability where you can sacrifice a creature to add 2 colorless mana. Both of these cards are infamous for the raw number of combos you can pull off with them. For example, if you have a Gravecrawler and any other zombie, you can sacrifice the Crawler to Phyrexian Altar to make a black mana, and then immediately cast it from your graveyard again. At that point, if you have any card that cares about a creature dying or entering the battlefield, you can win the game on the spot. For Ashnod's Altar, you can combine it with cards like Nim Deathmantle, an equipment that has the ability where whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you can pay 4 to return to the battlefield and attach Deathmantle to it. If you have a card that makes a creature token when it enters the battlefield, such as Resolute Reinforcements, you can repeat this infinitely. If you have a way to make more than 1 token each loop, you can make infinite mana. Or you can just win in largely the same way as with a Gravecrawler loop by playing cards like Zulaport Cutthroat. Of course, this is just one example of a combo for each of these cards. Both of these cards can be used in so many combos that it's basically impossible to go over each and every one of them. This has led to both of the cards being pretty infamous in Commander, where someone playing them is usually a surefire sign that the game is going to end sooner rather than later. These cards haven't quite broken into any constructed format, mostly due to not really having the chance. Both cards are only legal in Legacy and Vintage, meaning that they're competing with far more powerful cards. Ashnod's is legal in Pauper and has been used in combo decks at several points, though without higher rarity cards, it can be a bit difficult to get the combo with the card together. While they haven't put in too many results in 60 card formats, the cards are so prolific in Commander, both in casual and competitive, that the cards still have a place on this list. And at number 7, we have Greater Gargadon. This is a 9/7 beast with a mana cost of 9 and 1 red. It has to spend 10 for 1 red mana, meaning that you can pay 1 red mana to exile from your hand with 10 time counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can remove a time counter from it, and when the last one is removed, you cast it without paying its mana cost. When it's cast this way, it gains haste. It also has the ability where, while Gargadon is suspended, you can sacrifice a creature, artifact, or land to remove a time counter from it. This is a sacrifice outlet that has the ability to sacrifice a ton of different kinds of cards, which has several different applications. However, by itself, the card is just a bit too slow. Getting a 9/7 with haste for 1 mana is a good rate, but it takes far too long to get out. And sacrificing permanence is too high of a cost for it. Of course, very few sacrifice outlets are played completely fairly. Gargadon was used in a number of Bridgevine decks in Modern as a way to trigger their various death triggers. This is a deck built around Vengevine and Bridge from Below, both cards that can give you bodies while they're in the graveyard. Gargadon was a big looming threat that could trigger your Bridgevines, given it niche as one of the deck's sacrifice outlets, though it was eventually usurped by other cards we'll talk about later. Outside of Bridgevine decks, the card has also seen play unique Restore Balance decks in Modern. Restore Balance is a suspend card that you can't actually cast, usually forcing you to wait for 6 turns to get its powerful effect. Basically, it forces players to get rid of lands, creatures, and cards in hand until they have the same number of each, tying whoever had the fewest to begin with. If you can get rid of all your creatures and lands before it resolves, it will force your opponent to sacrifice all of their lands and creatures. This is where Gargadon came in, as you would simply sacrifice your entire board to Gargadon before it resolves, forcing them to get rid of everything, often leaving them without the ability to play the game. This would, of course, leave you with no cards in play either. But luckily for you, you have a suspended Gargadon you can just remove a ton of time counters from. Soon, or even the next turn, you'd cast the Gargadon against a completely unprepared opponent and hit them for 9 damage every turn, quickly ending the game. Of course, to get this to work, you need to find a way to cast the Restore Balance, and waiting 6 turns was far too slow. Instead, decks would cast it straight from their hand with either Electro Dominance or As Foretold. Now, this deck wasn't the best thing around, but it was the deck that made the best use out of Gargadon's unique combination of abilities. And at number 6, we have Evolutionary Leap. This was an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It has abilities where you can pay 1 green and sacrifice a creature to reveal cards at the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. You put that card into your hand and then the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is a card with a few different applications. The most common was to combine it with a deck that could generate tokens and use it to draw more creatures to generate a ton of card advantage. Back in Standard, this was often combined with the card Hangerback Walker. This was a 0/0 with a mana cost of XX that entered with X +1/+1 counters on it. You could pay 1 and tap it to put another +1/+1 counter on it, and when it died, you made a 1/1 Thopter with flying for each +1/+1 counter on the card. With Leap, you could sacrifice the Walker to draw a card, often another Walker, and then sacrifice the Thopters to draw even more cards. This is carried on into other formats such as Pioneer and Modern, where it's used in Hardened Scales aggro decks. This is a 1-mana enchantment that gives you an extra +1/+1 counter whenever you would put a counter on one of your creatures. These decks played a ton of creatures that interact with +1/+1 counters, such as the Walker, and often they had abilities that work with them dying. In Modern, Leap is used a lot more sparingly, mainly because they had access to cards like Arcbound Ravager that do a much better job letting you kill your artifact creatures if you wanted to. It's a lot more popular in Pioneer, where it's often used alongside the Ozolith. This is a 1-mana artifact with the ability where, whenever a creature you control with counters on it leaves the field, you can move all those counters onto the Ozolith, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can move all counters on it onto target creature. This lets you rack up damage very quickly, sacrificing a card like Walker to Leap, drawing a new threat, putting all of its counters on the Ozolith, and then moving those counters onto one of its Thopters after. Leap has a pretty specific role, but if a deck both wants to draw creatures and sacrifice them, it's probably the best card for the job. And at number 5, we have Falkenrath Aristocrat. This is a 4/1 Vampire Noble with a mana cost of 2, 1 black, and 1 red. It has flying and haste and has abilities where you can sacrifice a creature to give Aristocrat indestructible until end of turn, meaning it can't be destroyed by damage or by destroy effects. And if that creature was a human, you also put a +1/+1 counter on the Aristocrat. Aristocrat is actually the origin of a fairly common deck name in Magic called Aristocrats. This was a standard deck that used cards like Blood Artist and Zarathan Necromancer, which had beneficial on death triggers, such as draining life from your opponent or making zombies. This card was used alongside Cartel Aristocrat as a way to sacrifice your creatures when you wanted them to die. And as they both had the word Aristocrat in their name, the strategy of sacrificing your own creatures for damage also took on that moniker. Beyond both letting you sacrifice your creatures, they also shared the qualities of being evasive creatures and having the ability to protect themselves from your opponent's removal. This makes it very difficult for your opponent to try to stop what you're trying to do, as all of their removal spells were kind of useless once you had an Aristocrat on the field. Falkenrath Aristocrat was also just a huge threat that was very difficult to deal with, as it was difficult to block, difficult to kill, and could even get bigger if it wanted to. The Aristocrat would have seen use in aggro decks even without the rest of the deck taking form around it. Having such powerful cards it synergized with only made the card even more powerful. Outside of Standard, the card has seen far less play. A 4-mana card quickly became too expensive for Modern, and the card isn't legal in Pioneer. As such, it's mostly seen play in fairly niche community formats such as Canadian Highlander. While it hasn't been the most successful, Aristocrat had a great run in Standard and has left a huge impact on the game in its own way. And at number 3, we have Goblin Bombardment. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It is an ability where you can sacrifice a creature to deal 1 damage to any target. Considering how strong combining sacrifice outlets with cards like Blood Artist is, as we've mentioned on this list already, it's probably not shocking that just cutting out the middleman is quite good. However, the ability to ping creatures is probably just as important. While it won't often trade 1 for 1, once you sweeten the deal a bit with token generators or creatures that like dying, you'll be able to control the board with a single bombardment to a scary degree. For one, it makes combat a complete nightmare. No matter how your opponent blocks, you'll probably be able to snipe off any creature that they do block with. This makes the card a nightmare for any deck that plays small or medium-sized creatures. The card has quite a storied history, to the point where Wizards was very hesitant to reprint it or a card with a similar effect, only very recently printing the card into Modern in Modern Horizons 2. All the way back in the old days of Magic, the card was used alongside Enduring Renewal and 0-mana creatures. Enduring Renewal is a strange enchantment that prevents you from drawing any non-creature cards, but makes it so that any creature that's put into your graveyard is returned to your hand. With both Renewal and Bombardment on the board, you could play a creature, sacrifice it for 1 damage, and then play it again after Renewal puts it back into your hand. If you have a 0-mana creature, you could just do this infinitely to kill your opponent. This was the main combo of a deck back in Extended in 1999, back when Extended was a format. Since then, the card has hopped around a few legacy brews and made a home for itself in various CEDH decks until it was reprinted in Modern, where it hasn't seen all that much play. Bombardment is a card that's very powerful in high-power combo decks and in medium-powered formats. But in today's Modern that's dominated by very powerful aggro mid-range decks, any sort of combos are too slow and fair uses are just worse than other options. If let into a lower powered format, it would likely find a home, but Modern is just too fast for the card. Still, it's used in various Commander and CEDH decks, as well as Legacy of Historical Play gets it a high spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Altar of Dementia. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It is the ability where you can sacrifice a creature to make target player mill cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Speaking of Bridgevine, here we have the eventual best sacrifice outlet for the deck. Bridgevine had been running around Modern for quite a while, and it was a strong deck, though it wasn't too good. That all changed when Modern Horizons 2 came around to introduce 2 new cards to the format. First, by reprinting Altar of Dementia in the format, and by releasing the now infamous card, Hogak Arisen Necropolis. This led to a period of time known as Hogak Summer, when Hogak was the only deck that could possibly win anything. We've gone over this a few times before, so we'll keep this brief, but here's basically how the deck worked. Hogak was a massive 8/8 that you could cast from your graveyard, but you could only cast it by exiling cards from your graveyard and tapping creatures you control. In order to bring it back, you needed to tap 2 green or black creatures and exile 5 cards from your graveyard. The thing is, you could easily loop this card over and over by comboing Altar with the previously mentioned Bridge from below. Every time a creature you control died, Bridge would make you a 2/2 zombie. If you had at least 2 bridges in your graveyard, each time a creature died, it would make you enough creatures to bring back Hogak. And Altar could also target with a mill, milling 8 cards by sacrificing Hogak. So you would bring back Hogak by exiling 5 cards, sacrifice him to mill 8 cards, and make 2 zombies. Then tap those zombies and exile 5 cards to bring it back, netting 3 cards in your graveyard. You would then loop this over and over to deck out your opponent. Now, the deck could do way more. It didn't just have to kill you this way, and it had way more threats it could throw at you, which is why the deck was so dominant. However, if we went over everything this deck could do, we'd be here all day. Multiple cards needed to end up being banned to rein the deck in, hitting both Faithless Looting and Bridge from below, eventually hitting Hogak himself. Although Dementia has continued seeing play with Hogak and Legacy, showing just how strong the interaction is. Alter is one of the few cards on this list that can claim to have completely destroyed a format, more than making a name for itself in terms of sacrifice outlets. And at number 2, we have Yawgmoth Thran Physician. This is a legendary 2/4 human cleric with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black. It has protection from human, meaning it can't be dealt damage, blocked, or targeted by anything that's human or has a human source. It has the abilities where you can pay 1 life and sacrifice a creature to draw a card and put a -1/-1 counter onto one target creature, and you can pay 2 black and discard a card to proliferate. This means you choose any number of creatures or players with counters on them, and then put an additional counter of each kind there. As soon as this card released, Yawgmoth was recognized as a very powerful card. The ability to sacrifice a creature to draw a card is strong enough on its own, but the -1/-1 counter is extremely powerful. Similar to Goblin Bombardment, this can easily be used to snipe small toughness creatures. Of course, people quickly found a better use for this counter as part of combos. By combining Yawgmoth with cards with Undying, you could essentially draw as many cards as you want. Undying is a keyword that makes it so that whenever the creature dies, if it didn't have a +1/+1 counter on it, you return it to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. How the loop works is if you have 2 creatures with Undying, you can sacrifice one to put a -1/-1 counter on the other, essentially removing the +1/+1 counter, allowing you to sacrifice it again in the process, putting another -1/-1 counter on the creature you just sacrificed. This allows you to draw as many cards as you want, as long as you're willing to pay 1 life for each. Of course, this was only one aspect of the deck, as you could just play it as a mid-range deck if you wanted to, and just had this powerful combo on the back. Yawgmoth has also made a name for itself in Commander, where it's a powerful way for creature-based combo decks to draw more cards. Yawgmoth is one of the most successful sacrifice outlets we've ever seen, but there's just one card that's even more prolific. And at number 1, we have Viscera Seer. This is a vampire wizard with a mana cost of 1 black. It is the ability where you can sacrifice a creature to scry 1, letting you look at the top card of your library and either putting it on top of your library or the bottom. It's also worth mentioning Carrion Feeder, a 1/1 zombie for 1 black that has the abilities where it can't block, and you sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on the feeder. Seer has seen a bit more play than Feeder, but there's not really a consensus on which one is generically more powerful. These cards have mostly seen play simply because they only cost 1 mana and allow you to sacrifice a creature for no mana, a function so powerful that players have joked that a 0 mana card that simply lets you sacrifice permanents for no effect would be playable. However, Seer and Feeder both have quite good effects. Seer has been used in decks that want to sacrifice creatures as part of combos, as the ability to scry cards is very useful for digging for combo pieces. Feeder is more often used in aggressive strategies where a massive attacker can put a lot of pressure on your opponent. Both Feeder and Seer saw play in one of Bridgevine's sacrifice outlets before the deck was taken behind the shed. Overall, the cards are just the most efficient creatures for the job. They simply ask for the least amount of mana out of all the sacrifice outlets. In fact, they're the only 1 mana cards that allow you to sacrifice a creature without asking for additional mana. As such, they have a place in the metagame that no other similar card, no matter how powerful, could jostle them from. As such, they are the overall most powerful sacrifice outlets in the entire game. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, we'd love to hear about those ideas down in the comments.